Hey there, fake footballers. Welcome to the Week 6 Starts and Sits. It's a bit of a tongue twister. I'm your host, Greg Smith, at Greg Sauce on Twitter. Let's dive right into last week's picks. Quarterbacks. Let's start here. Did all right. Phillip Rivers, Eli Manning, Sam Bradford, all top 12 guys. On the 2 QB side, recommended Bortles, Cutler, and Cousins all finished as top 20 quarterbacks. With that said, on the sit side, we had some misses here. Andy Dalton and Joe Flacco both finished as top 6 QBs. Colin Kaepernick was the QB 8. So I feel like the process was correct on Kaepernick. He hadn't really shown much. Andy Dalton, I think I admitted in the piece last week that, if he proved that he could do it against the Seahawks, we'll be trusting him, or I'll be trusting him basically going forward. And as such, he's in my top 10 this week, and I'm ready to believe that Andy Dalton is an elite fantasy quarterback. It's a strange time we live in. Joe Flacco, I was worried about him not having enough weapons. It turns out that the 49ers defense is just that bad. So we'll remember to keep that in mind for future matchups with San Francisco. Stafford and Carr were good calls. They both finished pretty poorly. Carr did beat out Cousins for what it's worth against the stingy Broncos defense. But 9.9 points versus 8.9 points. Neither of these guys was great. One thing before we move on here, I have put some numbers in parentheses here. If you're used to these videos, you're wondering, hey, what's that number? Well, that number is where I had the quarterback ranked in that week. So in week 5, I had Rivers ranked as number 5. He finished as QB9. I had Manning ranked as number 7. He finished as QB2. So it's just to give us a little bit more relative value here, or we can compare one to the other. So even if someone didn't finish strong, we can see, well, did they finish where Greg expected them to finish? And in the case of Dalton, Flacco, and Kaepernick, that did not happen. But in the case like someone like Sam Bradford, it was pretty spot on. QB 12 when I ranked him 11th. Let's move on to running backs. Todd Gurley, Dion Lewis, every week starters. This is your final warning. TJ Yeldon, that was a pretty good call. He finishes RB 17. I think more good times are coming for him. This week against Houston should be a decent matchup. And then, the Jags don't play the worst schedule. Ronnie Hillman versus CJ Anderson. I kind of whiffed there, thinking that Hillman would do well against the Raiders. He did not. He only scored 2.6 points, finishes RB 53. Anderson didn't do much better here. He finishes QB 42 with only 4 points. Hillman did get hurt towards the end of the game, so that's something to monitor going forward in how we perceive and rank those guys. Charles Sims, I said he was a good PPR play. He ended up being a good standard league play too. He scored 13.6 standard points. Anthony Dixon, my early week prep seemed like a good play, and then as the week played out, we saw that Dan Herron was going to be involved there, and so we kind of swept him under the rug in terms of these starts and sits. That's why he's great out here. I think I did warn against using him, even though my early research indicated that he might have been a good play. On the sit side, DeMarco Murray proved me wrong. RB6 with 18 points. He got a lot of touches. I guess, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. He complained about not getting enough touches. They gave him more touches, and look, lo and behold, he produces. We'll see if that keeps going. That was a bit of a blowout game they played against the Saints, so he might not get that many carries every week. That's something to keep in mind. With that said, the Eagles' defense is good. So if they can kind of keep that up on that side of the ball, that should, pay dividends for the Eagles' running backs. Melvin Gordon finished outside the top 30. We talked about Anderson. Isaiah Crowell, RB 14 with almost 15 points. Touchdown dependent, sure. The analysis that Duke Johnson would eat too much into his touches wasn't necessarily wrong. Like, they're still using Duke Johnson a ton. I'm going to have a hard time ranking and evaluating Isaiah Crowell going forward. Even this week, he was a sit for a minute, then he was a start, and now I'm just going to, kind of ignore him for the purposes of this piece and say that, probably rank him where you would normally. Antonio Andrews, Darren McFadden. Andrews did okay, but kind of salvaged his day with a touchdown, and he's not going to get one of those every week, so I feel good about that call. And McFadden, RB29, clearly not start worthy. I ranked him 44th, so he did better than I thought he would. But now the rumblings are that after the Cowboys bye, that Christine Michael is going to be more heavily involved, and I think that's going to push McFadden even further away from startability. Wide receivers. Allen Robinson, wide receiver 2. I mean, I thought he was going to be good. I had him ranked as a starter, but 21st is not second, but I'll take it. Alshon Jeffrey didn't play. Hankerson, finished as wide receiver 76, but I feel like the call was good. He got hurt in that game, didn't play quite as much as, we would have liked in that matchup. We'll see how he recovers from that into the Thursday night game, which is actually currently happening while I'm recording this, not watching the game clearly. Kamar Aiken, I think he delivered on his promise. He actually finished exactly where I predicted he would at wide receiver 29. A very startable 7.8 points for your flex or for deeper leagues. Travis Benjamin similarly finished right around where we expected, 30th ranked versus 27th finish. And Jamison Crowder, he did about the same thing. A very reasonable point total, nothing extravagant. We'd like to hit a little bit more of a home run with some of these picks, but when you're digging this deep down the rankings, it's nice to just get a steady, reasonable number of points. On the sit side, Amari Cooper and Michael Crabtree, predictably both, kind of got hosed by the Denver defense. Brandon Cooks did surprisingly well. Wide receiver 8 with almost 17 points. It looks like the Saints might be turning it around a little bit. Some of that was garbage time, but some of it is just Drew Brees being back and semi-healthy, I guess. So it'll be interesting to see how Cooks and Snead and Coleman and Ben Watson and the running backs there in New Orleans kind of shake out as we go through the middle part of the season. I have a feeling that Cooks and Snead will kind of go back and forth as the wide receiver 1A and 1B. But I think that the only people you really want to own in that offense are Mark Ingram and Drew Brees. Not to say that you won't be able to start the receivers, but they're going to be hard to predict on a week-to-week basis. Golden Tate, wide receiver 38. I mean, I am just not really a fan of his situation. I think he's a fine player, but Stafford has proven that he is not a very good quarterback to this point in his career, and Tate is suffering because of it. Kenny Britt, wide receiver 91, didn't do anything. That was probably my best call of last week. Anquan Bolden might have been my worst call. He finished as wide receiver 8. I just don't know what to do with the Niners. It's it's hard because Kaepernick can go from looking competent to looking absolutely abysmal. Their defense really strains the way their offense has to play because the defense is so bad. I think Bolden moved up my ranks this week, but he's still in the 30s, and with so much uncertainty there, I don't anticipate seeing him move up a whole lot more than top 25 to 30, somewhere in there. It'll definitely be matchup dependent, and if you're in a deeper league, you can probably use him in a lot of weeks with some confidence because chances are the Niners are going to be playing from behind in a lot of their matchups. But I don't know, just be wary of any San Francisco player. I mean, including Carlos Hyde, who's obviously a very good running back, but just game flow and game script can pull him out of being usable very easily. Tight ends are next. Antonio Gates finishes tight end number 1. I had him ranked 4th. That was a nice call. Charles Clay, I think, disappointed a lot of folks. I don't know if this is really to blame on Charles Clay or on Tyrod Taylor. I don't mean to besmirch the Lord Ty God, but he did not look good in the first half of that game, and his receivers suffered because of it. Delaney Walker was fine. He scored 3.6 points. He finished his tight end 17. Owen Daniels did absolutely nothing, and he's just back on my shit list. We're done with you, Owen Daniels. Ladarius Green was a nice call. I had him pegged for tight end 16. He finished his tight end 13 with 5 points. I think that he's going to see continued use in San Diego, especially if Stevie Johnson is out. 2 tight end sets will help them run the ball a little bit more, which could open things up for Melvin Gordon. I think I talked about that last week. It does seem like it'll benefit the Chargers in general if they can play Green and Gates at the same time. On the sit side, Richard Rodgers kind of fell right where I thought he would. I didn't think he was quite good enough to be considered a top 12 guy. He finished his tight end 16 with 4.5 points. Heath Miller exceeded my expectations, but still, he's not a guy I think you want to use week to week. And in general, the Steelers with Michael Vick are a little worrisome. I think you can use Antonio Brown. I think you have to use Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell every week. But Heath Miller, their secondary receivers, I think you can easily take a pass on most of them most weeks. Dwayne Allen was a call that came in before the article went up, but I do update the Flowbotics spreadsheet beforehand, before the Thursday night game, and I'll try to get whatever starts and sits I feel are valid for that Thursday night game, and Dwayne Allen was one of those, and it paid off. He finishes tight end 26. I said to sit him. Vernon Davis did not play. All right, so that does it for the Week 5 review. Let's dive right into Week 6 with the aforementioned game flow spreadsheet. As you can see, the look of the spreadsheet continues to change. I did do away with the game flow prediction section. I do plan to add some more stuff to this, hopefully next week if I have time. We'll see how it goes, but let's start with Washington and the New York Jets. The Jets are pretty heavy favorites at home here, 6 points, very low total, 40.5 points. This does figure to be a defensive battle. I think that there are going to be probably one or two players on each side of the ball that could end up being usable. I'm in general avoiding most Redskins players. Getting over to the sits here, Kirk Cousins, Matt Jones, Pierre Garçon. I think if there was one player on Washington that I had to start, it would probably be Chris Thompson. This does seem like a game where catching passes out of the backfield is going to be more likely than, just running at that Jets front seven. So Matt Jones, Alfred Morris, no thanks. On the start side, I like Eric Decker. He's right in that early 20s ranking zone for me. I think the Brandon Marshall is obviously going to be good here. But Decker, when he's played, he's been good as well. And I would use him if I had him. One last thing to note here is that both of these defenses are probably going to be pretty good. The Jets are obviously a very good defense. They are the second overall in terms of DVOA, the best team against the run as well. So we could see a lot of turnovers here as the front sevens, stuff the run for the most part, and the quarterbacks are forced into third and longs where they're going to have to throw the ball, and that could lead to some turnovers, especially when you're talking about Ryan Fitzpatrick and Kirk Cousins. These guys are, not elite talents, and there are some fantasy points to be had playing against them, so keep that in mind. We'll go next to Arizona and Pittsburgh. Arizona road favorites here, 3 points, 44.5 point over under. Arizona is they're cruising, man. They look really good. The Steelers are in trouble with Vic at quarterback, and I mean that's reflected here in the line. It's reflected in my starts and sits as well. I talked about earlier how basically the only Steelers I think you can use are the elite guys, Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell. I'm still on the sit Heath Miller plan. Michael Floyd also a sit for me. I have a feeling that Larry Fitzgerald and John Brown will basically have free reign over this Pittsburgh secondary. They'll do whatever they want. Carson Palmer won't even need to throw to Michael Floyd. Michael Floyd is just going to let the other members of his squad do all the heavy lifting and the winning in this game. And so he's going to win the Let the Wookiee Win award for this week. I think Ty Montgomery has won it in previous weeks, and it will pop up from time to time on these good offenses where there are many different receiving threats. In good matchups, if you're the third receiver, you might just not see looks because your quarterback's going to have an easy enough time throwing to the better targets or the more consistent targets. I am going to say to start David Johnson. I know that the Arizona backfield has been a bit of a mess, if only because there are three dudes and all of them have been, pretty good. And the reason I'm still in on David Johnson is just because of what we saw last week in terms of usage, which was goal line work. If that's where he's going to see play, then he's probably going to be usable, if only because when he's not in the goal line and he's in there to spell Chris Johnson or spell Andre Ellington, he can always break one off or even get your return touchdown on special teams. So in general, I don't know if he's a safe play, but running back is such a wasteland that David Johnson is a guy that I think you can start this week in a nice matchup. Next up, the Chiefs and the Vikings. Vikings 4-point favorites at home here. Chiefs without Jamal Charles, and that's important because, one, it makes the Kansas City offense a lot less scary. I think that the Vikings are a nice streaming defense this week. And two, it makes us need to figure out what the hell to do with that Chiefs backfield. And is it going to be Charkandrick West? Is it going to be Nile Davis? I have a feeling we're going to see them both, and it wouldn't surprise me if Davis ends up being the guy who gets the most carries. But with that said, based upon the usage that we've seen so far, I don't think you can do anything but recommend Charkandrick as the lead back, or the prospective lead back at least, heading into this game. And as such, he's a start for me. I'm going to use him if I have him. I generally missed out on most of my leagues because I'm doing fairly well and I've spent a lot of fab already. It was kind of crazy to see the amounts that West went for in free agency or off of the waiver wire this week. But anyway, another guy I'm starting is Stephon Diggs, and this is a deep play, of course. The Vikings receiving core has been a little decimated, and, in general, not impressive, but Stephon Diggs led the team in targets last week. And, for a young guy with a young quarterback, maybe there's just some chemistry there that we can try to capture. And if you're playing in a deeper league, you want to take a flyer on a guy, I think Stephon Diggs is a guy that you can try to use and try to hit a home run, because the Chiefs are very bad against the pass, 29th in terms of DVOA on passing defense. So that's one thing to consider. On the sit side, Alex Smith and Teddy Bridgewater, very close in my rankings. I was kind of flip-flopping them back and forth, and I came back down to this DVOA rating of the Chiefs, 29th against the pass. And Alex Smith, sorry buddy, you're the sit this week, and Bridgewater, you're not being tabbed as a sit. You won't be a sit in the article, but I just don't know what to expect from you, buddy. You need to get a little more consistent for your fantasy owners' sakes. We need your help. Kyle Rudolph, in spite of this horrendous passing defense of the Chiefs, Kyle Rudolph is a sit for me, and this comes down to the fact that the Chiefs are generally very good against the tight end. They haven't given up more than 33 yards to tight ends in this season, except for one game, and that was against the Bengals, and Tyler Eifert hung 69 passing yards on them. And, Tyler Eifert is very clearly good, and if the Chiefs can limit him and then limit all other tight ends they're seeing, there's a good chance that they'll be able to take away Kyle Rudolph as well, and so I wouldn't use him this week. We'll go next to my nemesis, Andy Dalton, and the Bengals, going into Buffalo to face the Bills. Cincinnati 3.5-point favorites on the road. You can't blame Vegas on this one. If Tyrod's hurt, Tyrod doesn't play, that could just spell doom for Buffalo. There's a low total here, 42.5 points. Should be a defensive game. And, for that reason, I think most players should be ranked normally, especially on the Cincinnati side of the ball. I'm not super high on either of their running backs. I don't know if I'd call either of them sits in particular. I do have Giovanni Bernard ranked higher than Jeremy Hill for what it's worth. I think both guys are in the 15 to 25 range, but I'd check the rankings to be sure. I am going to recommend sitting most of the skill position guys on Buffalo. EJ Manuel, Percy Harvin, Charles Clay. Manuel's kind of a no-brainer, but even if you lost Tyrod, I have a feeling you can do better this week. Brian Hoyer is not a guy that I love, but he has a better matchup than Manuel. And just in general, what we've seen from Manuel in his NFL career does not, bode well for me in this matchup, and I think that Harvin and Clay are sits because of that. Next up are the Bears and the Lions. Lions 3-point favorites. Both of these teams have been super disappointing. This does seem like a good opportunity for Detroit to get their first win of the season. Very low total here as well, 42.5 points. I don't know, what can you say about this game? I like the opportunity for both offenses to move the ball. Neither of these defenses are great. I do think that Detroit's defense is a little underrated in terms of fantasy, particularly this week going against Chicago. Chicago is very generous to opposing defenses. Keep that in mind if you're really digging deep for a defense option. But with that said, let's talk about the starts. Jay Cutler, Marquez Wilson. This Marquez Wilson pick does kind of hinge on Alshon Jeffrey not playing. But even if Jeffrey doesn't play, I think that Wilson could produce in this matchup. I think that he could be fine as your wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4. Theo Riddick is a guy that I kind of like Charles Sims last week. I'll recommend Riddick as a PPR play. He's continuing to put up those numbers on a week-to-week basis. There has been some news recently about him possibly being injured, and that would not play well with this sit call in Amir Abdullah, especially because there have also been reports that say that Amir Abdullah's workload won't be reduced because of the fumbling issues. You can't really take the coaches for their word on that, but I don't know. I think maybe this Amir Abdullah sit call is not a great one. He's probably not ranked outside of my top 30 at running backs, but and if you have him, you might need to start him. But, if you're on the fence and you have another similar option, you might want to explore that. But pay more attention to the news on this backfield leading up to Sunday. If it turns out that Riddick's not going to play at all, then I think, you can basically flip-flop these guys, make Amir Abdullah start. Peyton Manning's memorial service is up next. Denver 5-0 somehow with Peyton Manning playing the worst football of his career, and You can't blame the dude. He's a legend. He's just getting old. But, for fantasy owners, we need production, and he's not giving it to us right now. I don't know if Cleveland is necessarily going to be the team to, slow him down too much. But just based on the raw skill that we've seen from Peyton so far, I don't think you can trust him coming into this week. There are just so many other quarterbacks that you could be using, ones with a little bit more seeming upside, which is bizarre to think about, but they're there. And just in general, QBs are so volatile that you can cut Manning in a 10-team league. You can bench him in a 2-quarterback league. There are just a lot of options available to us. And, we don't have to start him just because his name is Peyton Manning. So he's a sit. I have Ronnie Hillman as a sit, mostly due to the concerns about that injury that he suffered last week. But if he's ready to go, and then I think C.J. Anderson also joins him as a sit, just because that backfield seems so split. But if Hillman's out or limited, C.J. Anderson could become a guy you want to use in this matchup because Manning hasn't looked great. They might not have to throw, and if that's the case, they'll probably try to run the ball a lot, and that could move Anderson into startability. Travis Benjamin is another guy I'm avoiding here, and that's because Denver has been the best team against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed. They have the second best passing defense in the league. You have to have liked what you've gotten from Travis Benjamin to this point in the season, but this is a terrible matchup, and I don't think you can use him. With that said, I'd start Gary Barnidge, the tight end. I tried earlier in the season to really exploit tight ends going against the Broncos, and they're definitely a little more accommodating to fantasy tight ends than fantasy wide receivers. And Barnidge is just a guy that continues to produce and get a ton of targets in that offense. And, if that's going to keep happening, even if the matchup is tough like this one is, I have a feeling that Barnidge will still see enough volume to be relevant and startable. And in terms of tight ends, volume is very important because most of these guys don't get as many targets as wide receivers. And the targets and the zones of the field in which they're targeted can vary sporadically from player to player, team to team. To get a predictable guy like your Barnidges, like your Jimmy Grahams or Gronks or Tyler Eifert's, that's valuable, and I think that you got to start those guys when you have the opportunity. Owen Daniels, like I said, he's back on my bad side. We're not using him. I might not ever recommend him again. I might just make him a sit every week just to spite him. I don't even care if the matchups are good. If you can't put up points on the Raiders, man, what are you doing? All right, next up, Houston and Jacksonville. Houston's slight favorites on the road here. I don't know if I really like that. I think I like the Jags in this game. It doesn't figure to be high scoring at all. 43.5 point over under. But neither of these teams are good. And, when in doubt, home dog, I like the Jags here. A lot of injuries for Houston as well. Cecil Shorts, limited to practice. Nate Washington, I don't think he's practiced yet this week. Jalen Strong had 2 touchdowns last week. He's questionable. And, not a bad deep play, kind of along the lines of Stephon Diggs, especially if Shorts and Washington are out again and Strong starts. I think Strong could make for a sneaky player, like a very low-priced option in DFS, depending upon where you're playing. Anyway, let's get to the starts and sits. I'm using some Jags. I'm using Bortles, and I'm using TJ Yeldon. I have Hearns tabbed as a sit here, and that is due to injury concern. I think Allen Robinson is a no-brainer this week. But yeah, Hearns is a guy that, it was hard to trust him early in the season. He continued to produce. It seemed like we could start to trust him, and now he's a little dinged up, and I'm a little worried. So I'm not saying that he's not capable of producing. If he plays, if he's healthy, watch the practice reports. He could be fine for this game, and if he seems to be fine, if he's practicing in full on Friday, and pregame reports are good, gets a probable tag or something, I think you can probably use him, and he probably moves up my rankings. But as it stands right now, there's enough uncertainty to where I don't really want to use him. Miami and Tennessee is next. Miami coming off the bye, new coach, and that means a lot to me. Not necessarily long-term, but for this one game, I have a feeling that the Dolphins are going to show up. The opponent is not too rough. Tennessee, their numbers are a little inflated relative to how good they actually are. I think you can see in terms of DVOA, they're ranked 14th, but if you adjust for preseason projections, they're ranked 18th. I think that they're going to backslide a little bit. We kind of saw some signs of that from Marcus Mariota last week. With that in mind, I think that the Dolphins probably, I mean, they're getting a little more respect than they normally would. Spread's only 2 when they're on the road. So, that kind of means on a neutral field they'd be a 1-point favorite, and maybe that's correct. But just in general, I do like the Dolphins to bounce back here, and that's reflected with my starts. Ryan Tannehill, Lamar Miller, Jordan Cameron. I'd use all these guys this week. Cameron in particular, tight end has been so crazy. The new head coach is a former tight end, blocking tight end with that in mind, so be careful. One way or the other, either he's going to implement more running plays based on the blocking aspect, and Lamar Miller will be nice, or he'll feed his tight end because he's a former tight end, right? How can I lose? Yeah, in general, I liked a lot of these guys preseason, and maybe that's still weighing on me a little too much, and I shouldn't be so high on these guys this week, but I want to believe in the Dolphins, and I think that coming off the bye after firing Philbin, this is going to be a good week for them to do that. So keep that in mind. One more note on Lamar Miller before we move on here. The Titans, 28th against the rush in DVOA, so there should be room to run for Lamar Miller, and if you can buy him on the cheap, maybe now's the time to do it right before Sunday. Carolina and Seattle are next. Seahawks 6.5-point favorites, which is kind of surprising considering Carolina's undefeated. They're coming off a bye, but I get it. I mean, the Seahawks are the Seahawks. We expect them to be a Super Bowl contender, and one thing to take away from this game is that the over-under is very, very low. It's 41 points, and if you couple that with the spread, that would lead us to believe that Carolina is probably going to have a hard time moving the ball and scoring in this game. So, temper your expectations around Cam Newton. I think he's still probably a starter just based on his rushing floor. But, it wouldn't surprise me if he finished in the QB 14 to QB 20 range this week. I'm definitely not using Jonathan Stewart or Ted Ginn with that in mind. I think Greg Olsen, if you have him, you probably have to start him because you likely won't be able to do better at tight end. But in terms of starts, there aren't a whole lot of players that I think really vault above where they would normally be in the rankings this week. In general, this seems to be a matchup where you'll want both defenses. The one last thing I'll talk about is what to do with Marshawn Lynch and Thomas Rawls. I have a hard time trusting Lynch, even if he comes back for this game. I would worry that they would limit his snaps and his touches and keep Rawls and Fred Jackson involved to some extent. So if you have Lynch and maybe he's practicing in full by the end of the week and rearing to go on game day, he probably will rank in the 12 to 20 range for me at running back, which would still be startable, but I wouldn't be thrilled about it. And if you have some better options, like maybe you ended up with Deion Lewis on the cheap or something like that, plus your second round running back, I could see you leaving Lynch on the bench for one more week. Next up are the Chargers and the Packers. Green Bay, huge favorites, 10.5 points, really high over-under here, 50. We should see some scoring according to the Vegas line. Now, I'm going to tell you that maybe you shouldn't be so quick to jump on San Diego as a strong play in this game. And I would urge you to go look at Phillip Rivers' home and away splits this season. He has not been good on the road. The Packers defense is very good against the pass. They rank first in the league in passing defense DVOA, and they rank last in the league second to last in rushing DVOA defense. So I think it'll behoove the Chargers to try to run the ball, try to control the clock, keep Aaron Rodgers off the field. I mean, they probably won't be able to do it fully, but I would worry that this could be kind of a meltdown game for Rivers, and so he's outside of my top 12 at the position this week, and I don't know how much garbage time is going to be able to save him against such a stingy pass defense, such as the Packers. I'm going to recommend Ladarius Green as a start again. We talked about this in last week's recap, but they're going to use 2 tight ends. I'm going to use Ladarius Green. That's how it works. Tight end is such a crapshoot that any guy who's getting enough targets like Green should be somebody that you consider for fantasy on a week-to-week basis, unless you have one of those aforementioned sure things like Eifert or Gronk, etc. Next up, the Ravens and the Niners. Both these teams, have pretty bad defenses, so I'm surprised to see the over-under as low as 43.5. If I were a betting man, and I'm not really when it comes to, over-unders at least, I think I would like the over here. Baltimore almost favored by a field goal on the road. I think that's fair. But with that said, I like the opportunity for offense on both sides of the ball. And I'm going to recommend starting Colin Kaepernick. This is more of a 2 QB play, but I think he'll probably finish in the top 20 at the position. The Ravens have been very generous to opposing quarterbacks, and Kaepernick has that rushing ability that can keep him relevant even when the game does get into a rough shape. And on the Ravens side of the ball, Javorius Allen, I'm in, man. I'm worried about Justin Forsett. They say it's not a high ankle sprain, but if the injury didn't look that good when it happened and he's still not practicing, Allen could be a very nice bargain this week. Hopefully you snatched him up while you still had the chance off the waiver wire or even off of free agency. I know that in a lot of leagues, he wasn't even really a consideration on Tuesday and Wednesday for waivers. Kamar Aiken, I'm going to recommend him again. And Crockett Gilmore, assuming he plays, is another guy I like a lot this week. The Deflategate revenge game is next. New England going into Indy to face the Colts. The Pats, big favorites here, 7.5 points. But when I looked at this line, the VIG was shifted in favor of Indy, so more people were betting on the Colts. I don't know if that's just kind of a contrarian sort of line, but I'm sorry, I would not bet against New England this week. I have a feeling they're going to come out guns blazing. The over-under reflects that, 55.5 points. I don't expect the Colts to win this game by any stretch. They have not looked that good this year, and New England has looked very, very impressive. With that in mind, I'm starting LeGarrette Blount here. Dion Lewis landed on the injury report today. He isn't in the injury list here. I'll try to remember to add him before Sunday's games. But even when Lewis was healthy, I liked Blount's prospects in this game. I basically like all the Patriots, but most of them are no-brainer starts at this point. I think that Blount is the one guy that you would waffle on. Should I play him? Should I not play him? This week, I think against the Colts, they're going to want to just cram the ball down their throats. They're going to want to pound it. They're going to want to score a ton of points, and that'll probably lead to some goal line trips where Blount gets some work, and late game, hopefully garbage time, just running out the clock, taking it right to the Colts up the middle. I'm also going to recommend Dante Moncrief. I'm recommending against T.Y. Hilton, and this has generally been my stance on the Colts receivers this season. I think I like the way Moncrief fits within their system a little bit more than T.Y. Hilton, and I think it's a little easier to take a guy like T.Y. Hilton away, with tougher coverage, safety help, whereas Moncrief is going to run a few more of those intermediate routes, and he's big enough and fast enough and strong enough to, really win those routes. And I will like him in this game, if only because I think the Colts are going to have to throw, and that could bode well for Hilton, don't get me wrong, but I have a feeling the Patriots will be a little more willing to game plan against a guy like Hilton and what he brings to the table than what they can do against Moncrief. I feel like Moncrief is a little bit more matchup proof, and that's why I have him ranked higher. The only other guy I want to mention in this game is Frank Gore. I'm not recommending him as a surefire start this week, if only because game flow could really take him out of this matchup. But the Pats have struggled against the run, 25th in DVOA, and that is something that the Colts might look to exploit in this game. They just signed Ahmad Bradshaw, which doesn't bode super well for Frank Gore. But, if they can get him going early, if they can maybe get a turnover off the Patriots early and jump out to a bit of a lead, they might be able to grind some clock, get Frank Gore going on the ground. I don't totally buy that narrative or that scenario happening, which is why I'm not recommending him as a start. But I have a feeling, if you have Frank Gore on your team, he's a guy you're going to want to use this week, just based on volume and the potential to maybe get going against a poor rushing defense. Last up is our Monday night game, the Giants and the Eagles. Eagles 4.5-point favorites here at home, 50-point over-under. A little surprising to me. I would have expected the Giants to get a little bit more respect. They've been playing pretty well. I mean, they're leading that division, but maybe Vegas respects that Eagles defense as much as I do. And Eli has been prone to mistakes in the past, and the receivers for New York are admittedly banged up. I have a feeling that's where this line is really being driven, is by this Odell Beckham injury, the Ruben Randle injury, and the fact that Victor Cruz is still out. I almost called him Nelson Cruz. Still got a little bit of baseball in the brain. That's interesting. Anyway, I like the Eagles in this matchup. I think they're going to have to throw a bit, and so Bradford's a start for me. Josh Huff, a guy kind of filling in for Nelson Aguilar last week. He did all right, and if you're looking for another deep dart throw, he's a guy who could deliver this week. Maybe as another cheap DFS option if you're in a GPP and you want to try to hit a home run with a guy who's not going to be in many lineups. But yeah, in general, the passing defenses aren't great. New York ranks 20th. Philly's actually not bad. They rank 10th. But I have a feeling that the Eagles will have a pretty easy time throwing the ball. Sam Bradford is not an amazing quarterback, but this is a good matchup for him, especially when you consider that it's hard to run on the Giants. They have the second-ranked defense in terms of rushing DVOA. That does it. Thank you, as always, for watching and or reading. It's been a pleasure. Hopefully, you'll do well in your matchups this week. I hope this advice works out for you. Don't be afraid to use this data and make your own conclusions, though. Take a look at these DVOA rankings, these numbers. Go to Football Outsiders. Take a look at their DVOA rankings for defenses against number 1 receivers, number 2 receivers. Look for offensive line versus defensive line matchups. Those are the kind of things I'm going to hope to implement into this spreadsheet for next week and the weeks beyond. Might not get there next week. There's some extenuating circumstances. But with that said, we should get there eventually. I hope to have that data on here as well, kind of taking the place of the game predictions that we used to have. But yeah, in general, become your own expert. Use the data. Find out the matchups that work for you and your roster, because I understand, and you should understand, you're not always going to have the guys I recommend. And sometimes you're going to have the guys I'm recommending against, and you're still going to have to play them. That's just how fantasy football works. Sometimes you just got to, push some chips in the middle and, hope that variance bails you out, because that's the type of game it is. And, those are the breaks. Anyway, thanks again. We'll catch you next time. Adios.